Western leaders privately say Ukraine can't win the war. Did you know that? Did you know that? Western leaders privately told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that Ukraine cannot win the war against Russia and that it should begin peace talks with Moscow this year in exchange for closer ties with NATO. Did you know that? The private communications are at odds with public statements from Western leaders who routinely say they will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes until it achieves victory on the battlefields.
So Putin got to them, is what you're talking
about. The Wall Street Journal, which reported on the private remarks of Zelensky, said the public rhetoric masks deepening private doubts among politicians in the UK, France, and Germany that Ukraine will be able to expel the Russians from eastern Ukraine and Crimea. They won't, which Russia has controlled since 2014, and a belief that the West can only help sustain the war effort for so long, especially if the conflict settles into a stalemate, officials from 3 countries say. We keep repeating that Russia mustn't win, but what does that even mean? If the war goes on for long enough with this intensity, Ukraine's losses will become unbearable, a senior French official said, and no one believes they will be able to retrieve Crimea. According to its source, the newspaper quoted Macron as telling Zelensky that even mortal enemies like France and Germany had to make peace after World War II. Macron told Zelensky he had been a great war leader, but he would eventually have to shift into political statesmanship and make difficult decisions, the newspaper reported. The reason why Zelensky, who campaigned on peace and got 71% of the vote as a peace candidate, isn't negotiating is because the Nazis and the NATO will kill him if he negotiates peace. There was already a peace deal in April of last year, and guess who? Boris Johnson went from the UK and told him, you do this, you're going to be killed. He stopped negotiating. At the Munich Security Conference last week, General Peter Pavel, of the Czech Republic's president-elect and a former NATO commander, said this: we may end up in a situation where liberating some parts of Ukrainian territory may deliver more loss of lives than will be bearable by society. There might be a point when Ukrainians can start thinking about another outcome.
I'd like to wait to hear from Sean Penn.
So when he says there might be a point when Ukraine, that point was 11 months ago. That point has been here forever. And he's going to tell you about this. Neil Abrams is going to say it. In early April, Ukraine and Russia were reportedly close to a settlement. Then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson showed up in Kiev and told Zelensky that the West wasn't ready to. That's right. And you're going to be hung in the streets, is what the leader of the Nazis in Ukraine said. He will be hung from a tree. That's what they said. And that's why this isn't happening. Why? Because NATO doesn't want it to end. We want to prolong this war to try to put an economic hurt on Russia. We don't care how many Ukrainians get slaughtered or how their country gets turned into a crater. These people are psychopaths. New York notes that after the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, argued that Ukraine was unlikely to make substantial greater battlefield gains and should move to the bargaining table, the White House. So you know when that was? That was frickin' 11 months ago. He tweeted this out.
Oh, right. Before they send.
This was 5 months ago. This was 5 months ago that Milley said this. Aaron Mate tweeted out. We could have got to that point. We've known this since the goddamn war started, that this is only going to end in one way: peace negotiations, and Russia gets what they want. We know this is how it's going to end. And what does Russia want? Well, it started. They got Crimea. They wanted the Donbass, and now that's it. I don't know.
Donbass to be independent. Donbass wanted to be independent.
He recognized them as independent. And now he says all those deals are off the table, and they're even going into Kharkiv. Is that how you say it? Before its intervention in Ukraine, Russia cited NATO's eastward expansion, the deployment of missiles in Romania and Poland, war games near its borders, and the arming of Ukraine as red lines that the West had crossed. After a year of war, Western leaders appear now to be turning to a realist approach. Macron, for instance, at the Munich Security Conference, dismissed any talk of regime change in Moscow. Now, Biden said we got to have regime change, like Putin's got to go, and then his advisors immediately walked it back. Hillary Clinton's still saying so.
Why is the the default approach, not a realist approach.
Right?
We're going to have to switch it up to real.
So there it is. Macron, Germany, they've had it. Right now, there was 40,000 people in the streets marching against this war and to Germany to stop supporting this Ukraine war. They have a bigger anti-war movement happening in Germany than they have in the United States for sure. And so their politicians are starting to feel the heat. And there you go. They're like, hey, you got to negotiate now. But they know that he's going to get killed if he does, or if as soon as NATO's done with him, it doesn't go well. So that's really it. I don't really need to say any more of that. We've seen how this goes. Here's what the West is proposing for Ukraine right now, Kurt. They're trying to say, like, hey, the West will give you a bunch of military support. If Russia is never going to agree to this. What the Western let me use. The Russians are never going to agree with something. Here, what it is. There has been no reaction from Moscow about what's the proposal? Here's the proposal. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated in July interview with his country's state media, this compromise is no longer an option. Even giving Russia all of the Donbass is not enough. Now the geography is different, Lavrov asserted, and describing Russia's short-term military aims. It's also Kherson and the Zaporizhzhia, I don't know how to say that, regions, and a number of other territories. The goal is not negotiation, but Ukrainian capitulation. So that's how bad it is now. So the Ukrainians did it to themselves. They could have had a peace deal that actually was beneficial to them, and they don't have it now. And in the meantime, Macron, according to the Wall Street Journal report, said that Ukraine should press forward with a military offensive to regain territory in order to push Moscow to the peace table. Moscow was already at the peace table. You guys rejected it, and now Moscow is going to get complete capitulation from Ukraine. But what they want to do, the proposal is to bring Ukraine even closer to NATO than it already is, with greater access to weapons after the war. It should be on an agenda at NATO's annual meeting in July. The NATO summit must produce a clear offer to Ukraine, also to give Zelensky a political win that he can present at home as an incentive. So what they're saying is, hey, we're going to give you all these weapons after that. That's what you'll go back and sell your people. But Russia's never going to agree to that. There has been no reaction from Moscow about this proposal. Geopolitical analyst Alexander Mercouri, a friend of the show, in his video report on Saturday said Russia would likely be incentivized to continue fighting rather than enter peace talks with the knowledge that Ukraine would be so heavily armed by NATO after the war. The Russians are never going to agree with something like this. They must be saying to themselves that instead of agreeing to this plan, it actually makes more sense to continue this war because one of Russia's objections is total demilitarization of Ukraine. So they don't want Ukraine to have a military. So what Western powers are proposing is the opposite. Given that Russia considers it it's winning, which they are, there seems to be a general acknowledgement among Western governments that Ukraine can't win this war. Where's the incentive for Russia to even consider this plan? There isn't.
Well, when people put out that Russia miscalculated and they're losing, because I've heard that, and then what I hear is because they wanted to take over all of Ukraine or something. That was never the goal, right? Like,
no,
yeah.
The goal was to get them to stop. Well, they took over Crimea when the United States and the Nazis did a coup of Ukraine in 2014. That's when he was like, all right, we're taking Crimea, you motherfuckers. And then the people in Crimea voted to be part of Russia.
Right.
Just like the people in the Donbass wanted independence from Ukraine.
Because those ones already had laws on them where they're not allowed to speak Russian or whatever.
And now they're outlawing Russian, and he's doing all kinds of crazy stuff in Ukraine. So for Moscow, McCrory said Ukraine's demilitarization is an absolute existential matter. If Ukraine is going to get even more advanced weapons from NATO after the war, as opposed to what it would get whilst the war is underway, then it makes even less sense for Russia to stop the war and agree to this plan. Russia is facing a weakening adversary now, and Moscow clearly prefers that facing to a strengthened adversary later. So here, listen to what he says. So now you got Zelensky saying that if you stop funding this war, meaning America and the West, your own sons and daughters are going to die because Putin's going to invade everybody. Watch this.
His opinions and weakening and depleting of assistance loses, Russia is going to enter Baltic states, NATO member states, and then the U.S. will have to send their sons and daughters exactly the same way as we are sending their sons and daughters to war, and they will have to fight. Because it's NATO that we're talking about, and they will be dying, God forbid, because it's a horrible thing.
So what he's saying is, yeah, Ukraine's not in NATO, and so you guys don't have an agreement with us. But if you guys don't pretend like we're in NATO, and then you have to defend us, they're going to go ahead and invade a NATO country, and then you'll be fucked. That's what he's saying.
Putin can't just go into a pretend NATO country.
Putin's not going to go into, he's not going to go into a NATO country. He doesn't want to. It's NATO that has expanded onto Russia's border. That's what's happening. It's the exact opposite of what this guy's saying. It's the exact opposite of what you see on MSNBC, CNN, and most of Fox News. It's the exact opposite. NATO is the aggressor. NATO is expanding. Putin acted rationally because he was provoked by NATO and by the Ukraine government. Doing live stand-up comedy in Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Nashville, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets and become a premium member. Get access to all our content.